Marcus Walker was known around the office for his sharp mind and unwavering sense of justice. In his 10 years as a special agent with the FBI, he had seen a lot and had always managed to hold on to his principles, no matter the case or the pressure. While some of his colleagues might bend the rules to get things done, Marcus was a guy who played it by the book. Everyone knew that about him, and most respected him for it, even if it made some people uneasy. Marcus was a straightforward man, dedicated to his work. His partner, Sarah Thompson, was one of the few people who saw just how deeply his sense of justice ran. They'd worked together for years, tackling tough cases and growing into a strong, trusting partnership. While Marcus was serious and sometimes rigid, Sarah brought a light-hearted energy to their duo, balancing him out. She joked that Marcus's honesty was almost intimidating, but she admired it as much as anyone. One afternoon, as Marcus walked back to his desk from a quick coffee break, he noticed a heated conversation between two agents from his division. He didn't pay much attention at first, but snippets of the exchange floated over. There were whispers about money, shortcuts, and favors. At first, Marcus dismissed it, thinking they were just blowing off steam after a long day. But then he noticed something that made him stop. Agent David Evans, one of the department's heads, was in the middle of the discussion. David Evans had a reputation as a tough but fair type of leader. But Marcus had heard rumors over the years that not everything about David was above board. Some said he cut corners and didn't mind looking the other way if it suited him. But nothing concrete had ever come to light. Marcus had never been one for rumors, so he hadn't paid much attention before. But now, seeing Evans in what looked like a hushed conversation about something that didn't feel right, he couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. When Marcus caught Sarah's eye later, he shared his concern. "Have you ever noticed anything off about Evans?" he asked carefully. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Off how? Evans is a bit of a hard case, sure, but that's just his style, isn't it?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, thinking over what he'd heard. "Something doesn't sit right. I overheard a conversation today, and they were talking about things that sounded like more than just work frustrations." Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Marcus, you know how it is around here. People vent, and they say things they don't mean sometimes, especially when it's about the higher-ups." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already spinning. "Yeah, but it didn't sound like venting. I think there's something there." She looked at him closely, her expression shifting from amused to concerned. "You're serious about this?" "As serious as I can be," he replied, his eyes narrowing as he thought about it more. Something feels wrong, Sarah. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm not letting this go." Sarah sighed again, but nodded in understanding. She knew Marcus well enough to see that his mind was already set. "Just be careful. You know Evans is practically untouchable. You don't want to end up on his bad side if you're wrong about this." Marcus gave her a reassuring smile. "I know what I'm doing, but thanks." That night, Marcus found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling as he ran over the day's events in his head. The conversation, the way Evans had looked around before speaking, the tone of the other agents, it all felt off. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and they were all screaming that something wasn't right. The next day, he started paying closer attention. Whenever Evans was around, Marcus would quietly watch and listen. It didn't take long before he started noticing patterns, odd meetings, quick conversations that cut off as soon as anyone got close, and the occasional envelope being slipped between hands in dark corners. One evening, Marcus stayed late, determined to find something concrete. As he sifted through files and documents, he stumbled upon a few irregularities in recent case reports and budget allocations. They were small, almost unnoticeable, but they added up. It didn't take much for Marcus to see what was happening. Funds were being siphoned off, likely into some slush fund or worse. He sat back, taking a deep breath. There it was, the proof he needed, or at least enough to start digging deeper. Marcus knew he couldn't go to just anyone with this. Evans had connections, and he'd likely have eyes everywhere. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. His heart raced as he thought through his next steps, his mind already preparing for what was bound to be a dangerous game. Later that evening, he confided in Sarah again, showing her what he'd found. She was shocked but didn't try to talk him out of it this time. She could see the determination in his eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice laced with worry. Marcus nodded, trying to keep his tone light. "I promise. But I can't just ignore this, Sarah. This goes against everything we stand for." As he left the office that night, Marcus felt the weight of his decision settle over him. He knew he was stepping into something much bigger than himself, but he couldn't look the other way. Not now. In the following days, Marcus found it nearly impossible to shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. Every small interaction he had with David Evans or the other agents involved in the scheme only deepened his suspicion. It was like watching a puzzle slowly come together, each piece revealing more about the depths of corruption within the department. Yet, with each revelation, he felt the stakes rising. He knew he was crossing a line that could cost him his job, or worse. One afternoon, during what should have been a routine investigation, Marcus stumbled upon the kind of concrete evidence he'd been waiting for. He and Sarah had been going through the case files for a recent sting operation that had seemingly gone off without a hitch. The suspect had been apprehended, the charges filed, and the case closed. Everything looked tidy, too tidy. Marcus's instinct kicked in, and he decided to look closer. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking for. The documents all looked legitimate. But then he noticed an odd detail. A small transfer of funds listed in the expense report that didn't match the operation's other expenses. It was minor, something most people wouldn't think twice about, but Marcus had seen similar irregularities before. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the first shiver of realization creep up his spine. "Sarah, come take a look at this," he called out. Sarah walked over, her usual easygoing expression replaced by a look of curiosity as she glanced over his shoulder. "What am I looking at? See this transfer?" Marcus pointed at the line item on the report. "It doesn't make sense. We didn't need additional funds for this operation, yet someone signed off on a payment to a third party. And the recipient isn't listed anywhere in our internal records." Sarah frowned, squinting at the page. "Could be a clerical error, though, right? I mean, it wouldn't be the first time things got mixed up." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, though he could feel his gut telling him otherwise. "But let's cross-check it with the other recent cases." They spent the next few hours digging through the records, and it didn't take long to find similar transfers scattered throughout. Some were small, others significant, but they all shared one thing in common. Each one was connected to cases David Evans had overseen, and each transfer pointed to the same account, a shell company with no clear owner. As the pieces started to fit together, Marcus felt the weight of what he'd uncovered. It wasn't just a few under-the-table deals. This was a full-fledged operation, with money flowing into hidden accounts and likely feeding into illegal activities beyond the FBI's reach. His stomach churned as he realized just how deep this could go. Sarah's face had turned pale as she absorbed the scope of their findings. "This is bigger than I thought," she murmured. "If Evans is behind this, then who knows how many other people might be involved." "Exactly," Marcus replied, his voice steady but grim. "We're talking about a network, not just one or two bad apples. And if Evans has been running this for years, then he's probably covered his tracks well enough to keep anyone from noticing. But you noticed," Sarah pointed out, her gaze sharp. "And if you can piece this together, maybe we can build a case." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "We're going to have to move carefully. Evans has connections, and if he gets wind of this, we're both done. Worse than that, Sarah, our lives might be at risk." The warning hung heavy in the air. Sarah had always known Marcus was serious about his work, but she could see the strain in his face now. This wasn't just a matter of reporting a co-worker for misconduct. It was a direct confrontation with a powerful figure who would do anything to protect his interests. Over the next few days, Marcus doubled down on his investigation, staying late at the office and poring over files until his eyes burned. Every document he reviewed seemed to confirm his suspicions. Money was disappearing, and Evans was at the center of it all. Yet, even as he gathered more proof, Marcus knew that simply having evidence wasn't enough. He'd need a plan, and allies he could trust. One night, after another long shift, Marcus sat in his car, contemplating his next move. He had enough information now to know that what he'd uncovered would shake the foundation of the department. But going public wasn't an option, not yet. He'd need to go through the proper channels, and he couldn't afford a single misstep. A knock on his car window jolted him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah. She'd stayed late too, worried about him. She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, giving him a worried look. "Marcus, you're in too deep," she said softly. "You know what you're up against. These aren't just shady agents. They're powerful people with everything to lose. I don't want to see you get hurt." "I appreciate that, Sarah," Marcus said, glancing over at her. "But I can't let this go. If we don't take a stand, then nothing will change. They'll keep lining their pockets, and innocent people will keep paying the price." Sarah sighed, looking out the window. "Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't help you if something goes wrong, and you're putting a target on your back." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But someone has to do it. And if not me, then who?" For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of his decision settling around them. Marcus knew he was crossing a line that would change his life forever, but he couldn't ignore what he'd uncovered. His sense of justice demanded that he see it through, no matter the cost. As he started the car and drove off into the night, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready. He'd face whatever came his way, even if it meant going up against some of the most powerful people in the FBI. In the days that followed, Marcus felt a growing tension within the walls of the FBI headquarters. Rumors circulated of an internal review coming down from Washington, and though no one openly connected it to him, Marcus suspected his quiet investigations had caught the attention of someone higher up. Word traveled fast in their circles, and if David Evans was as powerful as he seemed, he would have heard the whispers by now. But Marcus had no choice. He was already too deep in his investigation to back out, and he'd gathered too much evidence to ignore. Each night, he would return home and secure files on his personal drive, compiling an unbreakable case that, if successful, could expose Evans and any others connected to the operation. But with each passing day, he felt the weight of the risk he was taking. One afternoon, as Marcus sat alone in the break room, Evans walked in. His usual self-confident, smug demeanor had been replaced by a colder, sharper edge. His eyes locked onto Marcus, and there was no mistaking the hostility in them. "Marcus," Evans began, his voice carrying the kind of calculated calm that only years of experience could perfect. "I hear you've been looking into some old files. Thought you'd be busy with all your other cases, yet you seem to have a lot of spare time these days." Marcus didn't flinch. He held Evans's gaze, determined not to show the slightest hint of fear. "Just doing my job, David," he replied, his tone cool. Following up on some things that didn't quite add up, Evans smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Careful with what you dig into, Marcus. Sometimes you might find things that aren't meant to be seen. And trust me, once you've seen them, there's no going back." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. Marcus knew Evans was testing him, trying to intimidate him into silence. But he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He held his ground, refusing to be cowed by the man's thinly veiled warning. "If there's something I'm not supposed to find," Marcus said evenly, "then maybe it shouldn't be there in the first place. We both know how this works, David. I took an oath to uphold the law, and that includes going after anyone who thinks they're above it." Evans's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flash of anger in the man's expression, a hint of the ruthlessness he kept hidden behind his professional facade. But then, just as quickly, Evans regained his composure, nodding as if in understanding. "All right, Marcus," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If that's how you want to play it, then so be it. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Evans turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of what had just transpired. It was clear now. Evans knew exactly what Marcus was doing, and he wasn't about to let him go unchecked. Marcus had just declared war on a man with powerful allies and unlimited resources, and he knew that Evans would retaliate with everything he had. But Marcus also knew he couldn't let this go. He'd come too far to back down now, and he had to trust that justice would prevail, even if it meant risking everything. Later that evening, as Marcus was driving home, he noticed a black SUV following him. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he turned down a side street, hoping to lose the vehicle. But the SUV stayed on his tail, matching his every move. Keeping his cool, Marcus took another sharp turn, then another, until he was weaving through the streets in a calculated pattern. Finally, after a tense few minutes, he managed to slip into an alleyway and park, watching as the SUV sped past without noticing him. He exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a clear message. Evans wasn't just threatening him. He was actively monitoring him, maybe even planning his next move. As he sat there, catching his breath, Marcus's mind raced. He'd always known the risks, but now it was real. Evans wasn't just going to let him build a case in peace. The man was ruthless, and he had no intention of letting Marcus interfere with his operation. When he finally made it home, Marcus immediately locked his doors and set his files in a secure location. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, even in the safety of his own home. He paced a small living room, going over every detail of his investigation in his head. He knew that if he made one wrong move, he'd be signing his own death warrant. The next day, he reached out to Sarah, arranging to meet her in a public place. He couldn't risk bringing her into his home, not with the possibility that Evans had someone watching his every move. They met at a bustling coffee shop on the other side of town, where the noise of customers and the clatter of cups would drown out their conversation. When Sarah arrived, Marcus quickly filled her in on the confrontation with Evans and the SUV that had followed him home. Her face went pale as she listened, her eyes wide with fear and concern. "Marcus, this is serious," she said in a low voice. "You can't keep doing this alone. You need backup, someone who can watch your back." "I know," Marcus replied, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "But I don't know who I can trust. Evans has his people everywhere. If I bring the wrong person in, I could end up compromised, or worse." Sarah nodded, biting her lip. "Then we need to be smart about this. We gather what we can, piece by piece, until we have enough to take him down without risking your life." "Agreed," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But I can't let this go, Sarah. Evans and his people are a threat to everything we stand for. And if we don't stop them, who will?" As they sat there, surrounded by the sounds of everyday life, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Evans had drawn the line, and Marcus was ready to cross it. The path ahead would be dangerous, but he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. In the days that followed his confrontation with Evans, Marcus became more vigilant. He took a different route to work each day, never left at the same time, and avoided his usual routines, wary of the invisible eyes he felt were constantly on him. He was living under a shadow, but if Evans thought intimidation would stop him, he was dead wrong. Marcus was more determined than ever to expose the corruption festering in his own department, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, people he could trust implicitly, individuals who shared his dedication to justice. His mind went back to a handful of former colleagues he'd worked with on previous cases, people who had proven their loyalty time and again. One name stood out above the rest: Amelia Carter, an agent who had been one of his closest allies on a previous FBI operation. She was known for her relentless pursuit of justice and had even put her career on the line once before to expose corruption. Marcus reached out to her cautiously, sending a brief, cryptic message to arrange a meeting at a discreet location. Amelia responded quickly, agreeing to meet him later that night at a quiet bar on the outskirts of the city. When he arrived, Marcus scanned the room, relieved to see that Amelia was already waiting. She gave him a small nod as he approached, her expression serious. After exchanging a quick, tense greeting, they took seats in a dimly lit corner where they could speak without being overheard. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked, her voice low but filled with concern. "You wouldn't call me like this unless it was something big." "It's bigger than I ever thought, Amelia," Marcus replied, leaning in. He quickly filled her in on what he had discovered, from Evans's network of dirty agents to the threats he'd received since he'd started digging. Her face hardened as she listened, her jaw clenched in anger. "So, David Evans is at the center of this," she muttered, shaking her head. "I always suspected something was off about him, but to think it's this deep." "It's worse than we thought," Marcus said grimly. "He's got powerful friends and an army of agents under his control. If we're going to bring him down, we'll need airtight evidence and a plan to make sure this operation isn't swept under the rug." Amelia nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll need to be careful. If Evans catches even a whiff of this, he'll come down on us hard. But I have contacts who might be able to help us. People who specialize in covert operations within the Bureau. They're as clean as they come and have a knack for staying under the radar." Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. With Amelia on his side, he felt like he had a fighting chance. She was sharp, resourceful, and unafraid of bending a few rules for the greater good. They spent the next few hours discussing their strategy. Amelia suggested they start by securing encrypted communication channels and setting up anonymous drop points for sharing information. She even offered to take the lead on digging into some of Evans's key associates, suspecting they'd find a few skeletons in their closets that might help build their case. As they wrapped up their meeting, Amelia placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We'll get him," she said, her voice steady. "But you have to be careful, Marcus. Evans won't hesitate to take you down if he feels threatened. Promise me you'll keep your head down and stick to the plan." Marcus nodded, though he knew it was easier said than done. He could feel the tension building around him, like a storm gathering on the horizon. But with Amelia's help, he felt stronger, more capable of facing the daunting challenge ahead. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly, gathering evidence piece by piece. Amelia managed to hack into a few secure databases, uncovering financial transactions that pointed to massive bribes and payouts funneled through offshore accounts. Marcus used his access within the Bureau to quietly track down more information on Evans's allies, building a profile on each one and cataloging their connections to various criminal organizations. Their work was exhausting, and every day felt like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. They met in hidden locations, always changing spots to avoid detection, and communicated through encrypted devices. Their bond grew stronger as they continued their mission, both of them driven by an unyielding commitment to justice. But despite their best efforts, Marcus could sense the pressure mounting. He started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near his apartment and felt eyes watching him whenever he walked down the street. One night, while reviewing documents in his living room, he heard a soft click at his window. His pulse quickened as he grabbed his gun, moving silently toward the noise. But when he reached the window, there was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the streetlights. It was a warning, a message that Evans was watching his every move. Determined not to let fear control him, Marcus doubled down on his efforts, working late into the night with Amelia by his side. They both knew the risks, but they also knew they were making progress. Every file, every intercepted message, every bank transfer they uncovered brought them closer to building an ironclad case. One night, as they reviewed their findings in Amelia's basement, they realized they'd gathered enough evidence to present a case to the Department of Justice. But they couldn't just walk in and hand over the files. They needed someone they could trust, someone who wouldn't be swayed by Evans's influence. Amelia suggested a respected federal prosecutor she had worked with in the past, a woman named Rachel Connors, who had a reputation for integrity and an unblemished record. If anyone could handle a case of this magnitude, it was her. Their plan was set. They would approach Rachel, present her with the evidence, and trust her to take it from there. But they also knew that once they made this move, there would be no turning back. Evans would know, and he would stop at nothing to silence them. As they finalized their strategy, Amelia looked at Marcus, her expression serious. "This is it, Marcus. Once we go to Rachel, there's no more hiding. We'll be in the open, and Evans will come after us with everything he's got." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words, but also a fierce determination burning within him. "I'm ready," he said. "It's time we put an end to this." And with that, they steeled themselves for the final confrontation, knowing that the battle they were about to enter would be the most dangerous one of their lives. The next morning, Marcus and Amelia sat in a secluded diner, their eyes scanning every face that walked through the door. It was time to take the evidence they had painstakingly gathered and put it in the hands of someone who could make it count. Marcus's heart pounded with both anticipation and dread. This was the turning point. At exactly 10 a.m., Rachel Connors walked through the door. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Marcus and Amelia as she approached their table. Rachel had earned her reputation as one of the most formidable federal prosecutors in the state, known for her integrity and a history of taking down powerful figures who thought they were untouchable. Agent Brooks, Agent Carter, Rachel greeted them as she took a seat. I hope you have something solid for me, because if what you're claiming is true, we're about to kick a hornet's nest. Amelia slid a thick manila envelope across the table toward Rachel. Everything's in there, she said quietly. Bank statements, wire transfers, internal memos. We've got enough to take down Evans and his entire network. Rachel didn't waste time. She pulled out a pair of reading glasses and began flipping through the documents right there in the diner. As she read, her expression darkened, her brows knitting together in disbelief. I knew there were rumors about corruption in your department, but this, she trailed off, shaking her head. This is beyond anything I've seen. Marcus leaned in closer. The problem is, Evans has eyes everywhere. If he gets wind that we're moving against him, he'll disappear, and so will all of this evidence. We need to act fast. Rachel nodded, her mind already strategizing. We'll need to secure warrants and organize a task force, but we'll have to keep it off the books. If Evans has people inside the DOJ, any official paperwork could tip him off. They agreed to meet later that evening at a secure location Rachel would arrange, where she would finalize her plans and involve only the most trusted agents in her circle. Marcus and Amelia left the diner, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. They were on the cusp of bringing down a powerful network of corruption, but they knew Evans would not go down without a fight. That evening, as they prepared to meet Rachel again, Marcus received an encrypted message on his burner phone. The message was brief. You're running out of time, Agent Brooks. Walk away while you still can. Marcus showed the message to Amelia, who cursed under her breath. He's getting desperate, she said, her eyes narrowing. We've rattled him. Or he's just toying with us, Marcus replied, shoving the phone into his pocket. Either way, we stick to the plan. They arrived at the designated meeting place, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. Rachel had chosen it for its seclusion and the fact that it was owned by one of her most trusted contacts. As Marcus and Amelia entered the building, they were greeted by Rachel and a handful of agents she had personally vetted. Let's move quickly, Rachel said, motioning them over to a table where a map and several folders were laid out. We're planning simultaneous raids on the key locations tied to Evans's operations. Once we hit them, there's no turning back. But as they were deep in discussion, the sound of screeching tires echoed outside the warehouse. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. Everyone get down, he shouted just as a series of gunshots rang out, shattering the windows. Chaos erupted as agents drew their weapons, scrambling for cover. Amelia pulled Rachel down behind a stack of crates while Marcus fired back at the attackers. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sounds of bullets ricocheting off metal. They found us, Amelia hissed, her eyes wide with panic. How the hell did they find us? Doesn't matter now, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. We have to get out of here with the evidence intact. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus noticed a figure outside giving orders, a familiar face he had seen in the precinct. One of Evans's trusted men, an agent named Todd Jacobs. The betrayal stung, but Marcus had no time to dwell on it. He needed to focus on getting everyone out alive. "Rachel, do you have a back exit?" Marcus yelled over the gunfire. "There's a door in the back," she shouted back. "But it's locked. We'll need to blast it open." Amelia nodded, pulling out a small explosive charge from her bag. "I've got this," she said, sprinting toward the door with Marcus covering her. In seconds, she had rigged the charge and detonated it, blasting the door open. "Go, go, go!" Marcus yelled, pushing Rachel and the other agents through the smoky exit. He fired a few more shots to keep the attackers at bay before following the others out. They emerged into the cold night air, panting and covered in dust. Marcus's heart pounded as they ran toward their vehicles, bullets whizzing past them. They had narrowly escaped, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Evans's men were everywhere, and now that they had made their move, the gloves were off. As they sped away into the night, Rachel turned to Marcus and Amelia, her face pale but resolute. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Evans is desperate, which means we're close. But we're going to need more firepower if we're going to take him down." Amelia nodded, glancing at Marcus. "Looks like we're all in now. There's no turning back." Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The stakes had just gotten higher, but he refused to back down. They were so close to bringing Evans and his network of corruption to justice. No matter the cost, he was prepared to see it through to the end. The narrow escape from the ambush weighed heavily on Marcus and Amelia as they drove through the darkened streets. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every car that passed seemed like it could be one of Evans's men. Marcus clenched the steering wheel, his eyes flicking constantly between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "Do you think we were set up?" Amelia finally asked, breaking the tense silence in the car. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she feared the walls had ears even here. Marcus nodded grimly. "There's no other explanation. Someone close to Rachel must have tipped them off. Evans's network runs deeper than we thought." Amelia leaned back, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "If he's got moles even in her circle, how can we trust anyone?" she muttered, rubbing her temples. Marcus didn't have an answer. The situation had spiraled into a dangerous game where one wrong move could mean the end of everything they had worked for. But there was no time to dwell on it. They needed to regroup and figure out their next steps before Evans made another move. After a tense, silent drive, they arrived at a safe house, an old, abandoned apartment that Amelia had secured through a contact who owed her a favor. The place was a dump with peeling paint and the stench of mold, but for now, it would have to do. They couldn't risk using their usual hideouts after what had happened. Rachel arrived shortly after with 2 trusted agents, both of whom she swore were clean. "I've known these 2 for years," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her worry. "If they were compromised, we'd already be dead." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't fully convinced. Paranoia had become their new reality, and trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. They sat around a dusty table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single lamp. The room was filled with tension as they laid out the evidence once more, trying to decide their next move. "We can't wait for a full task force," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Evans has too many people in his pocket. We need to act before he can cover his tracks or silence anyone else." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "We have the evidence, but without a coordinated strike, we'll be going in blind." And if we get caught, she didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. They would either end up dead or in a cell with no hope of getting out. Amelia leaned forward, her voice resolute. Then we take the fight to him. We hit his main operation tonight, before he has time to relocate. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. The longer they waited, the slimmer their chances of catching Evans off guard. "All right," he said finally, "but we go in small, just us and Rachel's men. No backup, no reinforcements." Rachel hesitated but eventually nodded. "Fine, but if this goes south, we'll be on our own." They quickly armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, a few handguns, tactical vests, and a couple of flashbangs. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Marcus could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, his mind sharpening with the clarity that came before a storm. As they prepared to leave, Marcus pulled Amelia aside. "Listen," he said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers. "If anything happens, you get out. Don't wait for me." Amelia shook her head, her expression defiant. "We're in this together, Marcus. I'm not leaving you behind." He wanted to argue, but there was no time. Instead, he simply nodded, hoping it wouldn't come to that. They both knew the risks, but neither was willing to back down now that they were so close to bringing Evans to justice. The drive to Evans's hideout was tense, the night air thick with anticipation. They parked a few blocks away, slipping through the shadows toward an old warehouse that served as Evans's base of operations. The building was surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards, but Marcus had anticipated that. "Take out the guards quietly," he whispered to Amelia and the agents. "We can't risk raising the alarm." One by one, they moved like shadows, taking down the guards with swift precision. Marcus's heart raced as they crept closer to the main entrance. They were almost in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place seemed too quiet, almost as if Evans was expecting them. As they reached the door, Marcus signaled for Amelia to plant the charge. The door blew open with a muffled explosion, and they rushed inside, guns drawn. But instead of finding Evans and his men, they were met with an empty room and a single laptop sitting on a table. "It's a setup," Marcus realized too late. The laptop screen flickered to life, revealing Evans's smug face. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Agent Brooks?" he taunted, his voice crackling through the speakers. "I've been one step ahead of you this whole time." Before Marcus could react, the building's light snapped on, revealing armed men pouring in from all sides. They were surrounded. The ambush had been perfectly laid, and now they were trapped like rats in a cage. "Fall back!" Marcus yelled, but the exits were already blocked. Bullets flew as they ducked for cover, firing back desperately. Amelia was by his side, her face set with grim determination as they fought to stay alive. Rachel's agents went down one by one, overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. Marcus and Amelia pressed on, refusing to give up, but it was clear they were outmatched. As Marcus tried to reload, a bullet grazed his shoulder, making him stumble. "Marcus!" Amelia screamed, dragging him behind a crate. Blood oozed from his wound, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay focused. This was far from over. "We need to find another way out," he gasped, wincing in pain. "There's no point in holding this position." Amelia nodded, her eyes scanning the room for an escape route. That's when she saw it, a small ventilation shaft in the corner. "Over there," she pointed, grabbing Marcus's arm. "It's our only chance." They crawled toward the shaft, bullets whizzing past them. As they reached it, Marcus lifted the grate, shoving Amelia inside first. "Go! I'll cover you," he yelled, firing back at the approaching gunman. With a final burst of gunfire, Marcus squeezed into the shaft behind her, the sounds of chaos fading as they crawled deeper into the dark, narrow tunnel. The air was thick with dust, and Marcus's shoulder throbbed with every movement, but they couldn't stop now. As they emerged into the cold night air on the other side of the building, they knew they had barely escaped with their lives. But even as they stumbled away, bruised and bleeding, one thing was clear. This fight was far from over. Evans had shown his hand, but Marcus wasn't going to let him win. "We regroup," Marcus said, his voice ragged. "And then we hit him where it hurts." Amelia nodded, her eyes blazing with renewed determination. "We're not stopping until we bring him down." The cold night air cut through Marcus's thin shirt as he and Amelia stumbled into the back alley behind the warehouse. Blood soaked his sleeve where the bullet had grazed him, but he pushed the pain to the back of his mind. There was no time to rest. They were on borrowed time, and Evans wouldn't let them slip away so easily. Amelia glanced over at him, concern etched on her face. "We need to get that shoulder looked at," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Marcus shook his head. "We can't stop now. He's going to be tightening the net around us." He pulled out his phone. The screen cracked from the skirmish. "Rachel, we need to reach her. If she made it out, we might still have a chance." The call went straight to voicemail. Marcus cursed under his breath. They were on their own. Amelia's eyes darkened as she processed their situation. "We're running out of allies, Marcus. Evans's reach. It's deeper than we ever thought." Marcus's jaw clenched. "That's exactly why we need to hit him hard. If we let up now, he'll bury every piece of evidence we've gathered." His voice was filled with a steely resolve that masked the exhaustion threatening to drag him down. They moved quickly through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows as they made their way to one of Amelia's backup safe houses on the outskirts of the city. It was a small, unremarkable building tucked between a row of abandoned shops. Once inside, Marcus collapsed onto an old sofa, wincing as Amelia inspected his wound. "You need stitches," she said, frowning as she cleaned the cut with supplies she found in a dusty first aid kit. "This is going to hurt." Marcus merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting Evans's men to burst in at any moment. As she worked, he tried Rachel's number again. No response. The silence was deafening. "We can't wait for Rachel," Marcus said, gritting his teeth as Amelia stitched him up. "If Evans really has his claws in the higher-ups, they'll be coming for us soon. We need to move." Amelia finished bandaging his shoulder and leaned back, her face pale but determined. "So what's the plan?" "We're running out of places to hide, and we can't take on Evans with just the two of us." Marcus stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. "We don't need a full strike team. We just need one shot, one move that'll force his hand." He sat up, ignoring the flare of pain. "The files. If we can get them out to the media, make it public. He won't be able to hide behind his connections." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about blowing this thing wide open? It's risky. He'll come at us with everything he's got." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Marcus replied. "If we make enough noise, he'll have no choice but to come out of the shadows. We just need to be ready when he does." Amelia nodded slowly, her mind already racing through their options. "Okay, but how do we get those files out? If Evans is monitoring every communication channel, he'll know the moment we try to upload anything." Marcus's eyes narrowed as an idea took shape. "There's an old contact of mine, a journalist named David Holloway. He's one of the few people I trust. If we can get the files to him, he'll make sure the story gets out." Amelia hesitated. "And you're sure we can trust him?" Marcus nodded. "If anyone can expose Evans, it's David. But we'll have to move fast. Evans will be watching every move we make." With the plan set, they packed up what little gear they had left and slipped out into the night once more. The city was eerily quiet, the tension in the air palpable as they made their way toward a rundown internet cafe that Marcus knew was off the grid. It was their best shot at reaching David without tipping off Evans's men. The cafe was nearly empty when they arrived, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Marcus quickly logged into one of the old computers while Amelia kept watch near the entrance. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he encrypted the files and attached them to a message for David. As he hit send, the screen froze for a moment, then displayed a message. Connection interrupted. Marcus's heart sank. "No, no, no," he muttered, trying to reconnect. But it was too late. The system had been compromised. "They found us," Amelia hissed, her eyes darting to the door. "We need to go. Now." Before Marcus could respond, the cafe's windows shattered as masked men burst through, guns drawn. Marcus grabbed Amelia's hand, yanking her toward the back exit. They sprinted through the narrow hallways, the sound of gunfire and shouting growing louder behind them. "Go left," Marcus yelled as they burst out into an alley. They ducked into a side street just as a black SUV screeched to a halt at the corner. Marcus fired a few shots at the tires, buying them precious seconds as they disappeared into the maze of alleyways. Panting, they finally managed to lose their pursuers, collapsing behind a stack of old crates in a deserted lot. Marcus's hands were shaking as he reloaded his weapon, his mind racing. "They knew exactly where we were," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "Someone's feeding them our moves." Amelia's eyes widened with realization. Rachel. What if they got to her? The thought sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "If that's true, then we're truly on our own," he said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew there was no turning back. They had crossed the line, and now it was all or nothing. Amelia grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce. "Then we finish this. We get to David in person. No more electronic trails." Marcus nodded, a fire reigniting in his eyes. "You're right. We can't afford any more mistakes. We go off the grid, reach David, and bring Evans down once and for all." As they disappeared into the night, they knew it was their last chance. The walls were closing in, but Marcus was determined. He had come too far to let Evans win. This was the final stretch, and Marcus was ready to risk everything to end the corruption that had nearly destroyed him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint glow over the city as Marcus and Amelia made their way through the empty streets. Exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, but there was no time to rest. The plan was set, and there was no turning back now. They had ditched their phones and any traceable technology after the ambush at the cafe. Now, they relied solely on their instincts and the knowledge that they were running out of time. Evans would be on high alert, knowing they were desperate enough to do anything. "David's last known address is about 2 miles from here," Amelia whispered, checking the small map she had scribbled on a piece of paper. "If he's still there, we might have a shot." Marcus nodded, adjusting the strap of his backpack where the files were securely hidden. "We need to move fast. Evans will have men everywhere. And if he gets to David before we do—" "I know." Amelia cut him off, her eyes hardening with resolve. Let's go. The walk to David's apartment was tense. Every shadow, every sound seemed to hold a threat. Marcus's eyes scanned their surroundings constantly, looking for any sign of Evans's men. But the streets were eerily quiet, almost as if the entire city was holding its breath. When they finally reached David's building, they approached cautiously, slipping through the side entrance to avoid drawing attention. Marcus's heart pounded as they climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor. They had no idea if David was even still alive, let alone willing to help. Amelia knocked softly on the door, her body tense. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the door creaked open a few inches, and a weary face peered through the crack. David Holloway's eyes widened in shock as he recognized Marcus. "Marcus? What the hell are you doing here?" David whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "No time to explain," Marcus said urgently. "We have the evidence, but Evans is on to us. We need your help to get this out to the world." David hesitated, his eyes flicking to Amelia and then back to Marcus. Finally, he nodded and opened the door wider. "Get in. Quickly." Inside, David's apartment was cluttered with papers, old coffee cups, and the hum of computer equipment. He was clearly in the middle of a deep investigation of his own. Marcus wasted no time, pulling the files from his bag and spreading them across the table. "This is everything," Marcus explained, his voice low but intense. "Evidence of Evans's corruption, bribes, even a network of officers involved in drug trafficking and murder for hire. We need you to publish it before Evans can silence us." David's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. This is insane," he muttered, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. "If this goes public, it'll bring down half the department." "Exactly," Amelia said, her tone firm. "But we need you to act fast. Evans knows we have this, and he won't stop until we're dead." David nodded, his face pale but determined. "All right, I have a secure connection. I'll start uploading everything to my network of journalists. We'll flood the internet with this before they can even think of shutting it down." As David worked, Marcus and Amelia kept watch by the windows. Tension thickened the air. Every second felt like an eternity. Marcus's thoughts raced with what-ifs. What if Evans found them before the files were released? What if David's network was already compromised? Then, just as David hit the final key to send the files, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the silence. Marcus's heart sank as he peered through the blinds. Black SUVs, identical to the ones that had ambushed them before, were blocking off the street. "They're here," Marcus said through gritted teeth, grabbing his gun. "David, you need to go. Now." "No," David replied, shaking his head. "I'm finishing this. If I run now, all this will have been for nothing." Amelia's eyes flashed with determination. "Then we hold them off." She turned to Marcus, her expression fierce. "We can't let them get to David. If these files go live, it's over for Evans." Marcus nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Let's do this." The first wave of attackers burst through the door, guns blazing. Marcus and Amelia returned fire, using the narrow hallway to their advantage. The air was thick with the sound of gunshots and the acrid smell of gunpowder. David stayed hunched over his computer, frantically typing as he uploaded the last of the files. "Almost there," he shouted over the chaos. "Just a few more seconds." But those seconds felt like hours as more men poured into the building. Marcus's shoulder burned from the earlier injury, but he ignored the pain, focusing on protecting David and Amelia. He could feel the weight of everything resting on their shoulders. If they failed here, Evans would win, and justice would be buried once again. Finally, a triumphant beep came from David's computer. "It's done," he yelled. "The files are live. It's over. As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw flashing lights through the window. But these weren't Evans's men. These were federal agents, called in by David's journalist contacts once the files had gone public. "Drop your weapons," a voice boomed from a megaphone outside. "This is the FBI." The corrupt officers hesitated, confusion spreading through their ranks. Marcus and Amelia seized the moment, disarming the remaining attackers as the federal agents stormed the building. Within minutes, Evans's men were in handcuffs, and the building was swarming with federal agents. Marcus let out a shaky breath as he watched Evans being dragged out in cuffs, his face a mask of fury. You'll pay for this." Evans spat, but his threats fell on deaf ears. The world had seen the evidence, and there was no escaping justice now. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Marcus turned to Amelia, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "We did it," he said softly, a smile spreading across his face. Amelia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yeah, we did. And we made sure they'll never hurt anyone else again." David approached them, a look of gratitude and admiration on his face. "You too just took down one of the most corrupt networks in the country," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Marcus shook his head. "We're just trying to do what's right." He glanced over at Amelia, who nodded in agreement. "And as long as there's corruption out there, we won't stop fighting." With Evans behind bars and the truth finally exposed, Marcus and Amelia knew their battle wasn't over. But for now, they had won a hard-fought victory. And for the first time in what felt like years, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that justice had prevailed.